Imagine Europe in the mid-14th century. The streets are quiet, too quiet. Whole towns echo with the silence of empty houses, abandoned fields, and shuttered churches. The Black Death has just swept through the continent, killing nearly half the population. Priests preach about divine punishment. Peasants toil under feudal lords. Knowledge is locked away in monasteries, copied slowly by weary monks. For many, life feels short, brutal, and fated to remain unchanged. And yet, beneath the despair, a spark flickers. In a dusty monastery library in Italy, a scholar stumbles upon a forgotten manuscript, the works of Cicero, the Roman statesman. To most, it is a collection of old words, but to him, it is a revelation, a glimpse into a world where humans asked questions, debated politics, and celebrated beauty. It feels alive, dangerous even, for it challenges the notion that truth must come only from the church. This rediscovery is not alone. Across Europe, scattered fragments of ancient wisdom resurface, texts by Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy. Each one whispers the same message. There was once a time when human beings believed they could shape their own destiny. The people who would heed this whisper would give birth to something extraordinary. They would call it Rinascimento, the Renaissance, a rebirth, and it would change the world forever. Our story truly begins in the city of Florence. It is the 15th century, and Florence is not a kingdom, but a republic, buzzing with merchants, bankers, and artisans. Unlike rigid feudal societies elsewhere, Florence thrives on competition, in trade, in politics, in ideas. Gold florins flow through its markets, funding cathedrals, palaces, and most importantly, patronage of the arts. At the heart of this bustling city is the Medici family. Bankers by trade, they become the unofficial rulers of Florence, using their immense wealth not only for power but to cultivate beauty and knowledge. Cosimo de' Medici, shrewd and calculating, fills his villa with ancient manuscripts collected from across Europe. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, surrounds himself with poets, philosophers, and artists. For the Medici, money buys more than influence. It buys immortality, carved in marble and painted in fresco. Picture young Leonardo da Vinci, an apprentice in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. He sweeps the floor, grinds pigments, sketches endlessly. But already his eyes see the world differently. Where others see a bird, Leonardo wonders how its wings work. Where others see a body, he imagines the machinery beneath the skin. Florence feeds this curiosity. It is a city where merchants debate philosophy in taverns, where cathedrals rise skyward with mathematical precision, and where art becomes not just decoration, but a mirror of human potential. Florence is not alone. Venice, with its ships spanning the seas, brings back knowledge from Byzantium and the Islamic world. Milan, Rome, and Naples join the ferment. But Florence, with its unique blend of wealth, freedom, and ambition, becomes the cradle of the Renaissance. Here, for the first time in centuries, Europe begins to believe that the individual, not just God or king, has power. And from this belief, the Renaissance flame will spread. The Renaissance is not only about paintings and cathedrals. At its core, it is a battle of ideas. For centuries, Europe's intellectual life was governed by scholasticism, the belief that truth could be found only through church doctrine and the writings of a few ancient authorities. But as scholars unearth more classical texts, a new philosophy takes root. Humanism. Humanism celebrates the dignity and potential of man. It insists that to understand the world, one must study language, history, ethics, and the arts, the studia humanitatis. It is not a rejection of God, but it is a shift of focus, from heaven to humanity. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, writes that the ancients are not dead voices, but living guides. Erasmus of Rotterdam, with his sharp wit, challenges corruption in the church and urges a return to true moral teaching. These men write not only for scholars, but for the common people, bringing knowledge out of cloisters and into the streets. And then comes the machine that will change everything: the printing press. In Mainz, Germany, around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg perfects a system of movable type. Suddenly, books can be printed in hours, not months. Knowledge spreads faster than ever before in history. The Bible, once chained to pulpits, can now be read in homes. Classical works circulate widely, fueling debate. Pamphlets, satire, political tracts, ideas multiply like sparks in dry wood. For the first time, Europe becomes a connected mind. And once people begin to think for themselves, nothing will be the same. Picture Florence in the year 1504. A massive block of marble, abandoned for decades in the cathedral yard, is hauled upright in the Piazza della Signoria. The crowd gathers, craning their necks to see. Slowly, the covering is pulled away, and there it stands, a towering figure of David, sling in hand, carved by a young sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti. The people gasp. This is no medieval saint, rigid and symbolic. This is a man of flesh and blood, tense muscles, veins alive with energy, eyes sharp with defiance. It is not just art, it is a statement. Man is powerful, man is beautiful, man is capable of greatness. This is the Renaissance in stone. The language of perspective. Before the Renaissance, paintings often looked flat, symbolic, more like spiritual icons than windows to the real world. Then, artists like Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti unlocked the secret of linear perspective, a way to create depth on a flat surface. Suddenly, paintings transform. Streets recede into the distance, buildings stretch upward, and figures stand in real space. The world becomes three-dimensional not only in art, but in thought. Now imagine standing inside the Sistine Chapel as Michelangelo lies on scaffolding, paint dripping into his eyes. He labors day after day, painting vast scenes from Genesis. Adam stretches out his hand toward God, almost touching. It is bold, human, daring. This ceiling is not just decoration for a chapel, it is a cosmic drama painted with the hand of genius. The masters of the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci paints the Mona Lisa, her smile a riddle that still teases the world. But he is more than an artist. In his notebooks, written backward in mirror script, he sketches flying machines, tanks, studies of muscles and bones. He embodies the Renaissance ideal, the universal man. Raphael captures grace and harmony in the School of Athens, where Plato and Aristotle debate at the center of a hall filled with the greatest thinkers of antiquity, painted as if they are alive, part of the Renaissance conversation itself. Botticelli paints the birth of Venus, a goddess rising from the sea, echoing ancient myths that would have shocked the medieval mind. These works do not only decorate walls, they reshape how people see themselves. Humanity is no longer just a sinful creature awaiting salvation. Humanity is a creator, a thinker, a shaper of destiny. Art as power. But art is never neutral. Rulers commission paintings and sculptures to glorify their reigns. Popes in Rome compete with Florentine bankers to sponsor the greatest masterpieces. Even Machiavelli, the sharp-eyed political thinker, notes that appearances, images, can be as powerful as armies. The Renaissance makes art a weapon of influence, but also a language of freedom. When people walk through Florence and see David towering above them, they do not see only marble. They see the courage of a small republic standing against mighty tyrants. By the early 16th century, art has broken its medieval chains. It is alive, human, emotional, and revolutionary. It prepares the way for another awakening, not of color and canvas, but of reason and inquiry. The Renaissance was not only painted in frescoes or carved in marble. It was also written in ink, measured with compasses, and whispered through telescopes in the dead of night. For while artists remade the world in beauty, scientists began to remake it in truth. A universe reconsidered. For centuries, Europeans believed in the geocentric universe of Claudius Ptolemy, the Earth fixed at the center, with planets and stars circling in perfect divine spheres. This view was not only scientific dogma, it was theology. To question it was to question the very order of God's creation. But in Poland, a quiet canon named Nicholas Copernicus began to wonder. He watched the planets and noticed troubling patterns. Mars would sometimes appear to move backward, a puzzle the old model could not explain. Slowly, carefully, he developed a bold idea. What if the Earth itself moves around the sun? In 1543, as he lay on his deathbed, his book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, was finally published. It was a whisper, a dangerous whisper, but it planted a seed that would change everything. Galileo's telescope. That seed found its most defiant voice in Galileo Galilei, a fiery Italian with little patience for authority. In 1609, he heard of a new invention in the Netherlands, a tube of glass that could magnify distant objects. Galileo built his own, pointed it at the heavens, and what he saw shattered the universe of the ancients. The moon was not a perfect divine sphere. It was scarred with craters and mountains. Jupiter had moons of its own circling it, proving that not everything revolved around Earth. Venus showed phases, just like our moon, which made sense only if it orbited the sun. Galileo declared openly the Copernican system was true. The Earth moved. The church, alarmed, summoned him to trial. In 1633, before the Inquisition, Galileo was forced to recant. Legend says that as he rose from his knees, he whispered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Though silenced, Galileo's vision could not be unseen. The telescope had opened a new window, and humanity would never close it again. The anatomy of man. The Renaissance curiosity extended not just to the heavens, but to the human body. For centuries, medicine was based on the writings of Galen, an ancient Roman physician whose texts had been copied and repeated without question. But in the 16th century, Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist, dared to cut open cadavers himself. In candlelit rooms, he revealed what Galen had never seen, the true structure of muscles, bones, and organs. His book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, was filled with detailed woodcut illustrations, transforming medicine from dogma into science. Where once the body was considered a mystery, Vesalius turned it into a map, a machine that could be studied, repaired, understood. The spirit of inquiry. From astronomy to anatomy, the Renaissance spirit of questioning spread everywhere. Francis Bacon in England promoted the scientific method: experiment, observe, test. Paracelsus challenged traditional medicine, experimenting with chemicals and minerals. William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood, a revelation that overturned centuries of medical belief. The Renaissance scientists did not always agree, and often they stumbled, but they shared a conviction. Truth was not something handed down by authority. Truth was something to be discovered through reason, evidence, and courage. A new worldview. By the early 16th century, Europe's worldview had shifted. The heavens were no longer fixed and eternal. The body was no longer a mystery. Nature was no longer a stage for divine miracles, but a vast system governed by laws that humans could begin to understand. The consequences of this awakening were profound. Once people realized that the earth was not the center of the universe, they began to wonder, could man himself also step out of the center of authority? Could rulers be questioned? Could societies be reshaped? The scientific awakening was not just about stars and blood. It was about freedom of thought. And once minds began to question the heavens, they would soon question the earthbound powers of kings and princes. Science had given humanity new eyes. But knowledge alone was not enough. To change the world, power and politics had to evolve as well. Next, we enter Chapter 5, Power and Politics, where Machiavelli sharpens his pen, rulers play the Game of Thrones, and the Renaissance reshapes not only how people think, but how they rule.
The Renaissance was not lived only in studios and observatories. It unfolded in palaces, council chambers, and battlefields, places where ambition, cunning, and strategy decided the fate of cities and nations. The Italian battleground. Picture Italy in the 15th century. Unlike France or England, it is not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, Naples. Each one is a jewel of wealth and culture, but also a rival in trade, diplomacy, and war. Florence, governed by the Medici, thrives on banking and patronage. Venice, mistress of the seas, builds a maritime empire stretching across the Mediterranean. Milan, a military powerhouse, is ruled by dukes who live as lavishly as kings. Rome, revitalized under Renaissance popes, becomes both a spiritual capital and a political stronghold. But this glittering competition makes Italy vulnerable. French, Spanish, and German armies march through the peninsula, drawn by its riches. The Renaissance is not only a rebirth of culture, it is also a struggle for survival. The pen of Machiavelli. Amid this turmoil rises a sharp-eyed Florentine diplomat, Niccolò Machiavelli. In 1513, disgraced and exiled from politics, he sits down to write a little book. It will not bring him back to power, but it will make him immortal. The Prince. Unlike the idealized mirrors of princes written in the Middle Ages, Machiavelli's work is brutally realistic. He declares that rulers cannot afford to be bound by morality when the survival of the state is at stake. A prince, he argues, must be both lion and fox, strong when needed, cunning when necessary. Better to be feared than loved, he advises, if one cannot be both. Power, Machiavelli insists, belongs to those who understand how men truly act, not how they ought to act. The book shocks Europe. Some see it as cynical, even diabolical. Others recognize in it the truth of politics laid bare. Whatever the judgment, The Prince becomes the handbook of power in the modern age. Diplomacy and the birth of the modern state. The Renaissance also witnesses the rise of diplomacy. With so many states vying for influence, permanent embassies are established, envoys sent across borders to negotiate alliances, treaties, and trade. Ambassadors, once mere messengers, now become professional diplomats, the eyes and ears of their governments abroad. This system of negotiation, intrigue, and balance of power is the ancestor of modern international politics. The Renaissance teaches Europe that brute force alone cannot rule. Words, intelligence, and strategy are equally vital weapons. Patronage as power. Art, too, becomes a political tool. The Medici commissioned grand chapels and sculptures to display their prestige. Venetian doges sponsor paintings that glorify the Republic. Popes like Julius II hire Michelangelo and Raphael not only to beautify Rome, but to remind all who enter the Vatican of the Church's majesty and strength. Every fresco, every statue is both art and propaganda. To walk through a Renaissance city is to walk through a living manifesto of power. Seeds of modern politics. The Renaissance transforms rulers from medieval lords into something new. Princes who govern states, not just feudal lands. This shift lays the foundation for the nation-states that will dominate Europe in the centuries ahead. Kings and rulers now see themselves not only as guardians of tradition, but as architects of destiny, able to shape their realms by strategy, reform, and image. Yet power also fuels conflict. Religious authority will soon collide with this new political ambition. As rulers strengthen their grip on earthly matters, others will rise to question spiritual ones. The Renaissance has reimagined politics as a game of reason, image, and control. But beyond Europe's palaces and parliaments lies a vast unknown. Oceans yet to be crossed, worlds yet to be mapped. In South America, Spanish conquistadors are discovering new empires, once native to Old World Sibylla.
The Renaissance was a rebirth of knowledge, art, and politics. But it was also a rebirth of horizons. For centuries, Europeans had lived within a world they thought they knew, bounded by familiar seas, ancient maps, and inherited myths. But the Renaissance thirst for discovery, combined with new technologies, would send ships across oceans, redraw the map of the globe, and set in motion forces that still shape our world today. Winds of curiosity. The Crusades had opened fragile channels of trade between Europe and Asia, bringing back silks, spices, and stories of distant lands. But when the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople in 1453, that land route closed. Suddenly, Europeans needed new ways to reach the riches of the East. At the same time, the Renaissance spirit whispered, "There is more to see, more to know, more to conquer." Prince Henry the Navigator. On the edge of Europe, in Portugal, a prince named Henry the Navigator sponsors voyages down the coast of Africa. His sailors push past Cape Bojador, a feared boundary of sea monsters and boiling waters. They return with gold, ivory, and slaves. Henry establishes a school of navigation where cartographers, shipbuilders, and sailors refine the art of exploration. The Portuguese developed the caravel, a light, fast ship with triangular sails that can harness the wind from any direction. With it, they edge further into the Atlantic, around Africa, and toward India. But in Spain, another dream stirs. An Italian sailor, Christopher Columbus, believes he can reach Asia not by sailing around Africa, but by going west. His calculations are wrong. He underestimates the size of the Earth. But Queen Isabella and King Fernando fund his risky venture. In 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After weeks of anxious waiting, land is sighted, not Asia, but the islands of the Caribbean. Though Columbus never truly understands what he has found, his voyage marks the beginning of Europe's encounter with the Americas. The world has grown larger and smaller overnight. A new world unfolds. Soon, fleets follow. Amerigo Vespuccio, whose name will be given to the new continent, recognizes that these lands are not Asia, but something entirely new. Ferdinand Magellan leads the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving the Earth can be circled by sea. Spanish conquistadores, armed with steel, horses, and gunpowder, topple mighty empires in the Americas, the Aztecs, the Incas, with devastating speed and brutality. Alongside them travel missionaries, merchants, and adventurers, each driven by a mix of greed, faith, and curiosity. Maps rewritten. Cartographers, fed with reports from explorers, redraw the world. Once, medieval maps had shown Jerusalem at the center, with mythical beasts lurking at the edges. Now, new maps stretch across the globe, charting coastlines, marking trade routes, connecting continents. For the first time in history, humanity begins to see Earth as a single, knowable sphere, vast, diverse, but connected. The double edge of discovery. The age of exploration brings wonders. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and chocolate enter European diets. Gold and silver flood into Spain, and new knowledge about geography and nature excites scholars. But it also brings horrors. The transatlantic slave trade grows. Indigenous peoples are decimated by disease and conquest. Ecosystems are transformed by the Columbian exchange. The Renaissance desire to know and conquer does not stop at discovery. It reshapes entire civilizations, often at a terrible cost. A world transformed. By the early 15th century, the world is no longer a collection of isolated regions. Oceans become highways, continents are linked, and Europe positions itself at the center of a truly global web. The Renaissance had begun with the rediscovery of the ancient world. Now it had opened the door to the whole world. But with new lands and new knowledge came new questions, especially about faith, authority, and the very soul of Europe itself. The Renaissance spirit of questioning would soon turn inward, sparking a revolution not just of art and science, but of religion. For all its brilliance, the Renaissance did not escape the shadow of the Church. In fact, it began within a deeply religious society. Cathedrals soared higher than palaces, popes wielded crowns as well as crosses, and faith guided the rhythms of daily life. But by the 16th century, that faith was under strain. The same Renaissance spirit that had questioned art, science, and politics now turned its gaze toward religion itself. The cracks in authority. The Church had long been the unifying authority of Europe. Yet corruption spread through its ranks, indulgences sold like market goods, offices bought and sold, popes more concerned with wars and luxury than with piety. Humanist scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam began to mock these abuses in biting satire. They called for reform, not rebellion, but the air was thick with discontent. And then came a hammer strike that echoed across the continent. Luther's 95 Theses. In 1517, in the town of Wittenberg, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. It was meant as an invitation to scholarly debate, but it was also an open challenge to Rome. Luther's message was radical in its simplicity. Salvation could not be bought through indulgences or mediated solely by priests. It came through faith alone, by God's grace. The Bible, he argued, should be the only true authority. What made Luther's protest explosive was not just the words, but the technology of the age. The printing press as a weapon. Luther's writings, quickly printed and reprinted, spread like wildfire. Within weeks, they were being read not just in Wittenberg, but in cities across Germany, then across Europe. Never before had a challenge to church authority moved so swiftly beyond the control of censors and bishops. The printing press, once a tool for spreading humanist thought, had become a weapon of religious revolution. Pamphlets, sermons, and translations of the Bible into vernacular languages gave ordinary people access to scripture and ideas in ways unimaginable a century earlier. The monopoly of Latin, of priests, of hierarchy, it was breaking apart. A fractured Christendom. What began with Luther spread quickly. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli and later John Calvin preached reform, emphasizing strict moral discipline and predestination. In England, King Henry VIII broke with Rome, creating the Church of England, partly for personal reasons, partly for national independence. Across France, Scotland, and the Low Countries, reform movements erupted, each shaped by local politics as much as theology. By mid-century, Europe was no longer a single Catholic community. It was a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant states, often at war with each other. The Catholic counterattack. The Catholic Church did not surrender. It responded with its own reform in the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563. Corruption was addressed, doctrine clarified, and the Inquisition strengthened. New religious orders, like the Jesuits, carried Catholic teaching across the world, from Asia to the Americas. The Counter-Reformation was not only about theology, it was also about art. In Rome, Baroque paintings and sculptures filled churches with drama and emotion, aiming to stir faith in the hearts of believers. Michelangelo's Last Judgment loomed over the Sistine Chapel, reminding all of sin, salvation, and judgment. Faith in flames. But alongside renewal came conflict. Europe plunged into religious wars that raged for more than a century. The 30 Years' War devastated Central Europe. In France, Catholics and Protestants fought bloody massacres, including the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day slaughter. In England and Scotland, kings and parliaments clashed over church and crown. Faith, once the glue of Europe, had become its fault line, the birth of freedom of conscience. And yet, from this chaos emerged something new. As people witnessed endless bloodshed, a question grew. Should rulers really dictate what a man believes? Slowly, the idea of freedom of conscience began to take shape. It would not be fully realized for centuries, but the Reformation planted the seed. The Renaissance had begun by putting man at the center of art and thought. The Reformation now put the individual at the center of faith, a believer standing before God without mediator. The Reformation tore Europe apart, but it also reshaped it. Religion was no longer a monolith. The map of Europe was permanently altered both politically and spiritually. And as faith fractured, the Renaissance legacy pressed forward. Science, art, politics, and religion all fed into a larger transformation. Europe was no longer medieval, it was something new, something we might begin to call modern. The Renaissance was never just a period in history. It was a turning point, a hinge between the medieval and the modern, between an age of tradition and an age of possibility. Its legacy runs like a river into every corner of our lives today. The rise of the individual. Before the Renaissance, people thought of themselves largely as members of a community. Peasants bound to lords, believers bound to the church, subjects bound to kings. But Renaissance art, literature, and philosophy began to celebrate something new: the individual. When Michelangelo sculpted David, he wasn't only depicting a biblical hero, he was showing the potential of man himself, standing tall, strong, and independent. When Shakespeare, a child of the Renaissance spirit, wrote his plays, he gave voice to characters with deep inner struggles, contradictions, and dreams. The modern idea that each person has dignity, value, and agency owes much to the Renaissance. It is the foundation for human rights, democracy, and the very concept of personal freedom. If you enjoyed this video and are still not subscribed, please consider it, as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you.